Every evening at dusk, for 11 years, after the lighthouse was shut down and the town stopped paying him to keep it, an old man named Sam climbed the spiral stairs and lit a lamp that no ship needed anymore. The Coast Guard had automated the real beacon years before, a small, efficient, blinking thing bolted to the rail, and they had thanked Sam for his service and told him kindly that he could rest now. But every night, just as the sun went down, behind the headland, a warm yellow light came on at the top of the old tower, steady and golden, nothing like the cold automatic blink beside it. The harbor master thought Sam was sentimental. The neighbors thought he was lonely. And only one person in the whole town knew the real reason that light came on every single night without fail. And she was watching for it at that very moment across the dark water from a window Sam had never once seen her sitting in. Welcome to the Lamplit Hour, where every story is a small light left on for someone who needs it. If stories like this bring you comfort, take a moment to subscribe and stay a while. So let the tide come in soft against the rocks, and let the gulls settle for the night, and let the long blue dusk come down over the water the way it does in late summer on the northern coast. Let me tell you about Sam and the lighthouse and the woman across the cove who watched for his light. Sam Holloway had kept the light on Pelee Point for 41 years, and his father had kept it for 30 before him, so that between the two of them, there had not been a single night in 70 years when a Holloway had not been responsible for the lamp that stood between the fishing boats and the rocks. It was not glamorous work, and it had never paid much. The keeper's cottage was a small, whitewashed thing crouched at the base of the tower, 2 rooms and a lean-to kitchen, its walls gone soft and salt-stained from a lifetime of weather, its windows small against the wind. In winter the spray froze on the glass. In summer the whole point smelled of warm grass and tar and the sea. It was a humble place, a working man's place, and Sam had loved it the way you love something you have given your whole life to, without ever quite saying so, and without ever once imagining living anywhere else. The work itself had a shape to it that Sam could have done in his sleep, and very nearly had on some of the long nights. You woke before dawn to check the lamp and trim the wick in the old days, and later, when they electrified it, to make sure the bulb and the great lens were doing their patient work. You spent your days on the endless small maintenance that a lighthouse demands, the brass to be polished, the windows of the lantern room to be cleaned of salt and the bodies of moss, the machinery to be oiled, the logbook to be kept in a careful hand. You watched the weather the way other men watch the stock market, because the weather was your whole livelihood and sometimes your whole survival. And at dusk, every dusk, no matter what the day it held, you climbed the stairs and you lit the light, and you stood for a moment at the top and watched it reach out over the water, and you felt every single time the small, clean satisfaction of a man who knows exactly what he is for. There are not many jobs left in the world that let a person feel that. Sam had been luckier than most, and he knew it, even on the hardest nights. He had not kept it alone for most of those years. He had kept it with Eleanor. Eleanor had been a town girl, and everyone had said she would never last out on the point, 3 miles from the nearest neighbor, with the wind and the loneliness, and a husband who had to climb the tower at all hours. But Eleanor had lasted. Eleanor had thrived. She had planted a garden in the thin salt soil that no one believed would grow. And it had grown hardy things, beach roses and sea lavender, and a stubborn row of beans. And she had made the little cottage warm against the worst the Atlantic could throw at it. And she had kept Sam company through 40 years of nights when the fog came in so thick you could not see the lamp from the foot of the tower. They had not had children. It had not happened for them. And they had grieved that quietly and privately, the way they grieved everything. And then they had turned to each other and made a whole life out of two people and a light. Eleanor used to say that the lighthouse was their child, that they fed it and tended it and worried over it and kept it burning through the night, and that in return it kept the whole coast safe. And that was a fair trade for a life, maybe the fairest trade there was. He remembered her in 100 small ways that had nothing to do with anything important, which is how you remember the people you have truly lived with. He remembered the way she sang to herself in the kitchen, old hymns and older folk songs, slightly off the tune, never knowing or caring that he could hear her over the sound of the sea. He remembered her standing at the cottage door on a summer evening with flour on her hands, calling him in from the rocks for supper, her voice carrying thin and clear across the grass. He remembered the winter the great storm took the roof off the lean-to, and the two of them had laughed about it afterward, soaked to the skin, because what else was there to do? He remembered her reading by lamplight in the long evenings, her glasses down her nose, reading him the good bits aloud, whether he wanted to hear them or not. 40 years of a woman's small daily presence, the particular weight and warmth and sound of one specific person sharing your one small life. That is what a marriage is in the end, when you strip away the word and look at what is underneath. It is 10,000 ordinary evenings, and when it is gone, it is the ordinary evenings you miss, not the grand occasions. Sam did not miss his wedding day. He missed her singing in the kitchen, off the tune, while the supper cooked and the light turned overhead. If this story is finding its way to you, a quiet like helps me keep the lamp lit for others. Eleanor had died in the spring, 9 years before the automation, of an illness that took her slowly over one long winter, so that Sam had nursed her in the little cottage with the sound of the sea always there beyond the walls, and had carried her, near the end, to the window so she could watch the light sweep out over the water one more time. She had died in their bed with the lamp burning above them, because Sam had had to go up and tend it even that night. Even that night, the boat still needed the light, and Eleanor would have been furious if he had let it go dark on her account. He had lit it and come back down, and she had gone not long after peacefully, with the golden light turning steady overhead. For the rest of his life, Sam would associate the warm gold of that lamp with the last hours of his wife, and he could not after that think of the light as only a light. It had been there for her dying. It had kept watch with him. A thing like that is no longer just a machine. So when the Coast Guard came, years later, with their efficient little automatic beacon and their kind words about rest, Sam had nodded and signed their papers and let them bolt their blinking thing to the rail. But that first night, when the new beacon began its cold mechanical blink, Sam had stood at the foot of the tower in the dark and felt something he had not expected. Not relief, but a kind of grief, sharp and surprising, as though Eleanor were dying all over again. The light that had kept watch over her last hours was to be switched off forever, replaced by a thing that did not know her, did not know any of it, blinked the same indifferent blink whether a keeper's wife was dying below it or not. and Sam had found that he could not allow it. He had climbed the stairs in the dark and lit the old lamp by hand, the way his father had taught him, the way he had done 10,000 times, and the warm gold light had come on over the water, and he had felt Eleanor near him for the first time since the funeral. And he had thought, all right then, I will keep you lit, not for the boats, for her, for us. I will keep you lit as long as I can climb these stairs. And he had, every evening at dusk, for 11 years, through fog and gale and the deep cold of January, up the spiral stairs with his bad knees and his lantern to light a lamp that no ship needed, because his heart needed it, and because some part of him still could not bear to let the dark have the last word over the place where Eleanor had lived and died. The town grew used to it. The new young harbor master found it odd but harmless, and let the old man be. Children invented stories about the keeper who would not stop keeping, and the warm gold light came on every night, steady and faithful, over the cold blinking beacon and the dark water and the sleeping town. What Sam did not know, what he had no way of knowing, alone out there on his point, was that across the cove, a mile of black water away, in a small house on the bluff, there was a window, and in that window, every evening at dusk, an old woman named Margaret sat down in a worn armchair with a cup of tea going cold in her hands, and waited for his light to come on. Margaret Vance had lost her husband the same year the lighthouse was automated. Daniel had been a fisherman, a good one, and the sea that had fed them their whole lives had taken him in the end, the way it sometimes does, in a sudden autumn squall that came up faster than the forecast promised. They had pulled his boat in, but not him, and Margaret, who had spent 40 years watching the water for her husband's return, found herself at 66 watching a sea that would never bring him back. She had stayed in the little house on the bluff because she did not know where else a woman like her would go, and because she could not bear to leave the view of the water that had been her whole life, even though the water had broken her heart. She and Daniel had been married 43 years, and they had been the kind of married that does not photograph well and does not make a fine story, but is in fact the realest thing in the world. He was a quiet man who showed his love by doing rather than saying, by mending her gait before she asked, by bringing home the first good fish of the season because he knew she liked it, by warming his cold hands at the stove before he reached for her on a winter night so as not to startle her. For 43 years she has stood at that same window watching for his boat to round the point in fair weather and foul, and for 43 years it had rounded the point until the one autumn afternoon it did not. The cruelty of it, the part Margaret could not get past, was that she had been standing at the window when it happened, watching the way she always did, and had seen the squall come up dark and sudden over the water, and had felt the first cold finger of fear, and had told herself, as she always told herself, that Daniel knew these waters better than any man alive and would bring the boat in as he always had. And she had watched and waited, and the boat had not come, and the dark had come down instead, and some part of Margaret had never left that window since. She watched the water still. It was the only thing she knew how to do. She had watched it for her husband for 43 years, and now she watched it for nothing at all, until the night she noticed the light. And it was from that house, that first terrible winter of her widowhood, that she had first noticed the light. She had been sitting at her window in the dark, as she did every night now, unable to sleep, looking out at nothing, at the black cove and the cold blinking beacon and the great emptiness where her life used to be. And then just at dusk, a warm gold light had come on at the top of the old tower across the water, soft, steady, nothing like the heartless blink beside it. It had looked in the middle of all that cold dark, like a small fire someone had lit on purpose for warmth, for company. And Margaret, who had no warmth and no company left in the world, had found herself, without quite knowing why, watching it, waiting for it. The next night it came on again, at the same hour, and the night after that, and Margaret began, without ever deciding to organize her grief-stricken evenings around it. She would make her tea and sit in the armchair by the window and wait, and when the gold light came on across the dark water, she would feel she could not explain it. She would have been embarrassed to try, a little less alone, as though someone over there on that lonely point was awake too, was keeping watch too, was saying without words into the dark, "I am still here. Are you?" She did not know who lit it. She had heard vaguely that the old keeper had lost his wife and would not give up the light, and her heart had ached for him, a stranger, in the particular way the newly bereaved ache for one another. But she had never met him. She had no reason to. They were two old people on opposite sides of a cold cove, each sealed inside their own grief. And the only thing that passed between them was the light, his light, going out across the water every night, and her eyes receiving it. For 9 years, 9 years of evenings. He lit it for Eleanor and never knew that anyone watched. She watched it for company and never knew the man who lit it. And the warm gold light went back and forth across the dark in the only conversation the two of them would ever have, which was no words at all, only this: "I am still here. Are you? I am still here." There were nights over those 9 years that Margaret would remember for the rest of her life. There was the night of the great November gale, when the wind came across the water so hard it rattled the very glass she sat behind, and the sea below the bluff was a black chaos of white torn waves, and Margaret had sat gripping her cold tea and thinking that surely tonight the old man could not climb that tower. Surely tonight the light would not come. And then at dusk, through the driving rain, the warm gold light had bloomed at the top of the tower, steady as ever, defiant, and Margaret had wept at her window, not from sadness, but from something closer to gratitude, because if that old man could climb his tower into the teeth of a gale and light his lamp, then she could get through one more night too. There was the anniversary of Daniel's drowning, the worst night of every year, when the grief came back so heavy that Margaret could hardly breathe, and she had sat at her window in the dark, wanting for the first time simply to be done. And the gold light had come on across the water, faithful, patient, and it had fell to Margaret in that moment like a hand laid gently over hers, like a voice saying, "No, not tonight, stay. I am still here. Stay with me until morning." She did not know the man who lit it, but on that night, and on 100 other nights, that light was the thing that kept her in the world. She had never told anyone. How could she? Who would understand that an old woman had been kept alive year after year by a light a stranger lit for his dead wife? But it was true. It was the truest thing in her life. And Sam, a mile away, climbing his stairs for Eleanor, never knew that he was also, every night, without the faintest idea of it, keeping a grieving widow on the right side of the dark. If you are still with me in the warm and the quiet, stay close. We are coming to the summer that changed it. It was the 11th summer, the 11th year of Sam climbing the stairs, the 9th of Margaret watching from her window. When Sam's knees finally began to fail him in earnest. The spiral stairs of a lighthouse are cruel to an old man's joints, narrow and steep and endless, and Sam had climbed them through pain for years. But that summer, the pain became something else, something that made him grip the iron rail with both hands and rest twice on the way up, gasping, his heart going too hard. He told no one. There was no one to tell. He simply climbed slower and lit the lamp and came down and did not let himself think about the day when he would not be able to climb at all, because he knew what that day meant. It meant the light would go dark. It meant he would have to let the dark have Eleanor's place at last. And he was not ready, and he did not think he would ever be ready. And so he climbed and said nothing. And then one evening in late August, the light did not come on. Margaret was in her chair by the window, her tea going cold, her eyes on the dark tower across the cove, the way she had been 1,000 nights before. The sun went down. The cold beacon began its blink. And the warm gold light, which in 9 years had never once failed to appear, not in the worst gale, not in the thickest fog, not on Christmas, not on the anniversary of her own husband's drowning, when she had needed it most. The warm gold light did not come on. Margaret waited. She told herself he was only late. She told herself the old man had fallen asleep, or the weather had kept him, or any of the small, ordinary things. But the dark stayed dark over the point, and the longer she watched the empty tower, the colder the fear grew in her chest, because she knew, the way you know a thing in your body before your mind will say it, that something was wrong over there, that the man who had not missed a single night in 9 years would not miss this one, unless he could not help it, that somewhere across that mile of black water, in a little cottage at the foot of a dark tower, something had happened to the only soul in the world who had kept her company through her grief. And there was not another living person who would notice, because she was the only one who watched. She was the only one who knew the light was supposed to be there. And Margaret Vance, who had not left her house after dark in 9 years, who was 68 years old and frightened of the water that had killed her husband, got up out of her chair and put on her late husband's old oilskin coat and went down to the little boat that still sat at her dock, the boat Daniel had taught her to run a lifetime ago. And she started the motor with hands that had not touched it in years, and she went out across the dark cove toward the unlit tower, because someone had to, and she was the only one who knew. The crossing was the longest mile of her life, but she made it, and she tied up clumsily at the foot of the point, and she climbed the path to the dark cottage, calling out, "Hello, hello, are you there? Your light, didn't..." And she found the cottage door unlocked, and she found Sam Holloway on the floor at the bottom of the tower stairs, where he had fallen an hour before, trying to climb to the lamp, his leg twisted under him, and his heart laboring, conscious, but unable to rise, unable to reach the stairs, unable to light the one thing he had promised himself he would keep lit as long as he lived. And he had been lying there in the dark, certain that no one would come, certain that this was the night the light went out for good and took the last of Eleanor with it. And then a stranger in a fisherman's oilskin had come through his door. Out of the night, an old woman he had never seen, and had knelt beside him and taken his cold hand in hers and said, I've got you, I'm here." They got him to the hospital, the two of them, and the ambulance that Margaret called from the cottage phone. It was his heart, as she had feared, and the fall had broken his hip, and the doctor said that if he had lain there until morning, as he surely would have, alone on his point, with no one to miss him. He would not have lived to see it. The only reason anyone had come, they said, was that someone across the water had been watching for his light, and had known the very night it failed to appear, and had crossed a dark mile of sea to find him. The young harbor master, when he heard the story, shook his head and said he had never understood why the old man kept that light burning all those years. But Margaret understood. Margaret had understood for 9 years. The light was never only a light. It was a man saying into the dark every night, "I am still here." And it had taken 9 years and one failed evening for the woman who had been answering him all along to finally cross the water and say it back to his face. Sam mended slowly, the way old men do. And when he came home from the hospital, he came home to a point that was no longer quite so lonely, because Margaret had got into the habit during his weeks away of crossing the cove in the daylight now to air out the cottage and water Eleanor's stubborn oak garden and have the kettle on for when he returned. It began, as these things do at their age, with small, ordinary kindnesses, rather than grand declarations. Margaret would cross the cove in the forenoon with a pot of soup because a man mending a broken hip cannot cook for himself, and she would find some chore to do while she was there, the garden, the windows, the brass that Sam could no longer keep up with. And she would have the kettle on when he woke from his afternoon sleep. Sam, for his part, discovered that he had things to say after 11 years of saying almost nothing to anyone, and that Margaret was a person worth saying them to. They talked about the sea, which they both knew the way, you know, an old enemy you cannot help but love. They talked about their dead, gently, without the awful, careful silence that other people always brought to the subject, because each of them had a grief the same shape as the others. And there is an enormous relief late in life in finally finding the one person who does not need anything explained. Margaret told him one evening what she had never told a living soul, that his light had kept her alive, that she had watched it for 9 years, that on the worst night of every year it had been the hand that held her in the world. And Sam, who had lit it all those years for Eleanor and thought it reached no one, sat very still for a long while and then said that he was glad, more glad than he could say, that the light had been doing 2 kinds of work all along, and that Eleanor, who had loved nothing better than feeding a hungry traveler or warming a cold one, would have been delighted to know her light had been keeping a widow company across the water the whole time. They were both far too old and far too shy and far too marked by their losses for anything sudden or foolish. But they were not too old for company. They were not too old to sit together in the evenings in the little whitewashed cottage and watch the dark come down over the water that has shaped and saddened both their lives. And here is the thing that Margaret did that first evening he was home, that tells you everything about what had grown between 2 people across a mile of black water without a single word. As the sun went down, she helped Sam to his feet, and she walked beside him, so up the cruel spiral stairs that he could not have climbed alone, her arm under his, step by step, all the way to the top. And together, the 2 of them, they lit the lamp. The warm gold light came on over the water, the way it had for 11 years, steady and faithful and golden. But that night, for the first time, there was no one across the cove watching for it from a lonely window, because the woman who used to watch was standing right there beside the man who used to light it, at the top of the tower, in the glow of the lamp they had lit together. And down in the dark town, anyone who happened to look out at the point that night would have seen the old light burning as it always did and thought nothing of it, and gone to bed comforted without knowing why. That is the quiet work that warm lights do in the dark. They keep watch. They say to whoever needs to hear it, I am still here. You are not alone. Hold on until morning. Those 4 years were not dramatic, and that was exactly their gift. They were made of small evenings, the very things Sam had missed most about being married. Someone in the other chair, someone to share the pot of tea, someone whose presence filled the cottage with the particular warmth that one specific person brings and no one else can. Margaret moved her armchair, eventually, across the cove, from her window on the bluff to a spot by the cottage stove, and the irony of it was not lost on either of them. For 9 years she had watched his light from a lonely chair a mile away, and now she sat in the glow of it, in the same room, in a chair that had come across the water to be there. They kept Eleanor's garden together, and Margaret learned its stubborn ways, and Sam taught her the names of things his wife had planted, so that Eleanor stayed in the cottage with him, welcome, unbegrudged, the way the dead should be allowed to stay with the living who love them. On clear nights, after they had lit the lamp, they would sit on the bench outside the cottage door and watch the stars come out over the water. Two old people who had each buried a great love and had not expected to be given another, smaller, quieter, no less real. And Sam would sometimes take Margaret's hand in the dark, not saying anything, the way Daniel used to, the way that says everything. Margaret had spent 43 years watching the water for a man and 9 more watching it for a light, and now, at last, she had nothing left to watch for, because everything she watched for was sitting right beside her in the dark. There is no arithmetic that can measure what those 4 small summers were worth to 2 people who thought their watching was over. Sam and Margaret had 4 summers together. In the end, before Sam's heart finally finished its long, good work and let him rest beside Eleanor in the little churchyard above the town. 4 summers, not many in the arithmetic of a life, but enough, more than enough, for 2 people who had each thought their share of love was over. And in those 4 years, they lit the lamp together every single night that Sam was able. And on the nights he was not, Margaret climbed the stairs and lit it herself, because by then it was her light too, their light, a thing they kept burning together for the same reason Sam had always kept it, not for the boats, but for love and for the dead, and for the simple, stubborn human refusal to let the dark have the last word. So if you are lying there tonight in some dark of your own, certain that no one is watching, certain that your small, faithful light goes out into an empty night and no one sees it, let Sam and Margaret be a quiet word in your ear. You cannot always know who is watching for your light. You cannot know whose dark evenings are being held together by the small, steady fact of you keeping on, keeping your lamp lit night after night, asking the dark your quiet question, I am still here, are you? Someone may be answering. Across a mile of black water you cannot see across. Someone may have been answering for years, and one night when your light fails, they may just cross the whole dark sea to find you, because that is what light is for, and that is what love is in the end. Not a grand thing, not a sudden thing, but 2 faithful people keeping watch for each other across the dark and crossing the water when it matters. After Sam was gone, Margaret kept the light herself for as many years as her own legs would carry her up the stairs. And then, when she could climb no more, A young couple from the town who had heard the whole story took up the keeping of it, and then others after them, so that the warm gold lamp on Peely Point still comes on every evening at dusk to this day, lit by hand, for no ship that needs it, only for the oldest and best of reasons. And somewhere in the dark town below, there is always someone, lonely or grieving or simply awake, who looks out at the water and sees that faithful golden light come on and feels, without quite knowing why, a little less alone. The tide is coming in now, soft against the rocks. The gulls have settled. The lamp is lit and steady over the dark water, and all is well on the point, and all is well across the cove. And you can let your eyes close now, knowing that somewhere a light is burning that will not go out, kept by faithful hands for love all through the night until the morning comes. There is nothing left to watch for. There is only the warm gold light and the sound of the sea and the long, good rest of those who kept faith with one another to the end. Thank you for spending this hour with me. If this story kept you company tonight, subscribe, and I'll leave the light on for you next time. Rest well.